So I made a video yesterday titled "What Really Is Human Nature?" and I was kind of debating or posing the question of is human nature the way we're meant to function? Is it more historically how we've been taught in recent times, particularly in like American culture and Western culture, that it's democracy, it's equality, it's freedom and liberty, and that really nobody is better than anybody else, or if they are better, that doesn't give them any rights over anybody, right? The whole idea of like a master slave or dominant versus like a subservient, that structure doesn't work. Not only does it not work, it's unnatural. It's not the way it's meant to be. The right way to approach society and the human race is that everybody should have equal voice and equal say, and nobody gets to decide how other people should act or how they should function. And versus, right, so that's one side, versus the other side, which is more of a what I would call like an animalistic view, which is there is a natural hierarchy in the world. You can look at wolves, you can look at lions, you can look at really any animal, and the way it functions in nature outside of the human race is there are certain alphas or animals that are more dominant, and they kind of dictate, and there's certain rights that come with that, and there are other animals that are subservient to them in some way, and that's more of the natural order. We don't like it. It seems counter to the morals we've developed, over recent history, over the last few hundred years, but it doesn't mean that it's not true. And in yesterday's video, I focused more on the former, trying to make the case for why I thought that more democratic, more equality-driven view was the right one. I want to kind of flip it today to the other side. And I should say, as I said in yesterday's video, whether it be because I was born and raised in this culture, and it just is what's ingrained in me, or because I've objectively looked at it and it's what I feel is right, I lean towards the equality democratic view, right? So that's to be stated. The reason I'm having this debate with myself, the reason I want to take the other side today is I want to see for sure as best I can. I don't want to just assume because I want it to be true that it is true. I want to actually explore it. So to look at it from the other side, if I try and make that argument or understand what that argument could look like, I think it starts with a relatively simple premise or a hypothesis or thesis statement that in many ways, as humans, what we're doing constantly is trying to impose our will over other people. So the whole idea that everybody is equal and nobody should impose their will on anybody, it's all very democratic, and everybody should be entitled to their own views and their own beliefs and how they want to act, sounds nice, but in reality, we're constantly doing the opposite. We don't say it, we don't like to say it, but it's the truth of the matter. And you can look at it and say that is almost the natural way in which we function. And take something very simple and clear cut that seems obvious and right, but is somewhat evidence of this. If there is a group of people who are racist, truly racist people, many of us would look at that and say, hey, that's wrong. You can't do that. You can't be racist in 2020. That's not okay. You need to change. You can't act in a racist way. You can't do things in your community that are racist. You can't not allow people in your stores because they're a certain race. To some extent, you can't even speak or post certain things on social media that are racist. They will be taken down, and they should be taken down. And many of us will look at that and say, yeah, that's reasonable. Racism is bad. That's a bad thing. That's the way it should be. But if you really break it down, what's happening there is we're imposing our will on those people. We're saying our way of thinking is better than yours, right? So pick whatever word you want to use, dominant, stronger, better, however you define it. We're saying we are thinking better than you, and it's not okay the way you're thinking. Therefore, you need to conform to the way we're thinking. Now, again, in that case of racism, most people, or at least a good chunk of people, would agree with that, so we're okay with it. But it doesn't change the fact that we are imposing our will on a group of people and saying, you can't think that way. You need to think like us. Now, the common retort to that would be, hey, listen, you could think however you want to think. It's when you take actions that start to hurt other people in some way, that's where we draw the line. So I'm not going to impose my will on you unless you force me to. And I get that argument, but it becomes very gray. By that I mean, how do you define harm, right? How do you define the point in which now they're harming somebody? Again, is it when they do a physical act of violence? That seems relatively clear cut. But what about if they're just speaking racist, hateful rhetoric? Do we stop that? Is that potentially harming people psychologically, or is it inciting somebody else to cause violence and we want to stop that? Right? It becomes very gray, and more often than not, we err on the side of, it's less about you actually technically literally harming someone. It's more about those ideas and those concepts that we don't like and they're not okay. And you could take it with racism, you could take it all different directions. You could take it with capitalism, you could take it with communism, socialism, right? If somebody believes in communism and that's what it should be, many of us will say, hey, that's not okay. We don't want communism here. That's not what we're doing. And we impose our will on that and say, push aside that communist view. You can't think that way. You can't propose that. You can't start to enact those views and those beliefs in a community. So again, it's interesting because, myself very much included, we like to believe that we are not imposing our will on other people. But the hypothesis is that we constantly are. In all actions of life, it's a constant ongoing effort of us each in different scales, right? Sometimes it's individuals, sometimes it's collective groups. We're trying to impose the things we believe on other people, and we want them, or sometimes force them, to buy into it. Which would lead you to say, well, maybe that is true then. Maybe the truth of it is it's not democratic, it's not equality for all, it's who can impose their will better on other people, who's more effective at it, who can do it in a better way. And that's the way our society functions, right? And that's the way in which it works. That seems wrong. That seems blasphemous, almost to say, but it doesn't mean that it is wrong, right? It could still be true. And I guess when you think about it a little bit more, this idea of imposing our wills on people, perhaps it's also that we should step back and say, we don't have to put a negative charge on that. The idea that imposing your will on somebody, and maybe that's the wrong phrase to use, but that carries a negative connotation. We feel like if somebody's doing that, that's a wrong thing to do. But perhaps it's just, again, it's natural. It's almost like what I would talk about, the universal principle of logic, that things happen because they're meant to happen that way. And that's how society functions. That's how things get done, right? If nobody imposes their will on anybody, and everybody is totally entitled to do, act, think, speak however they feel about whatever topic, you almost could envision this chaotic scenario where there's no order, there's no structure into society, and nothing can actually get done. There's no progress, there's no movement, right? So there has to be some imposing of will on people to get people gathered together, galvanized and organized to work towards some end. The question then becomes, which I'll tackle in another video, is what's the right way to do that? If it's a given that somebody or some group has to impose their will, and likely multiple groups, if you assume that has to be true, let's just assume that for this case, what's the best way to do it? You look at a way like a Hitler did it, or you look at a way like others have done it throughout history, and you say, well, that's probably not it, right? That's probably not the way to do it. And I would probably agree, but I think it's important to understand if we know there's a wrong way, then there has to be a right way. And it's important to kind of figure out what that right way may be. And that's kind of the path I'd like to go down. And I think I'll end on this. It has to do with this way of thinking. If we accept the idea that we're constantly imposing our wills on others, I think it helps to incentivize us to be more objective, to think much more about how we think and how we develop our beliefs and views and how we try and impose that will. It's when we hide from that fact that we're imposing our will on others that we get too comfortable, and there's this illusion of, I don't have to worry about thinking better because everybody's free to do their own thing. If we acknowledge that that's not actually true, we would hold ourselves to a higher standard of making sure we think better. But more to come on that.